Hi, I'm Abby, I have a lot of records, and this is Vinyl Monday. So welcome back, or welcome if this is your first time here. Vinyl Monday is the who, what, when, where, why, and how do I feel about classic albums in my collection. If 30-minute episodes aren't your thing, don't worry. I also do Vinyl Monday in 60 seconds, here on my channel, over on my Instagram, as well as TikTok. It's been a while since I've covered anything related to the Beatles on this channel, and given some pretty significant Beatle-related headlines over the past 2 weeks, what better time than the present? I'm sitting here acting like I don't plan these episodes out months in advance, and this is just a wonderful coincidence. Planned or not, this week's album is Paul McCartney, the album colloquially known as McCartney I. To that one guy in my comments who will surely be like,
actually, it's McCartney and Led Zeppelin 1 is also just Led Zeppelin.
Shut the fuck up. The existence of McCartney's 2 and 3 render this McCartney 1. Congrats if you guessed this McCartney 1. Remember, if you want to play along, all you gotta do is check out my community tab. That's where I post my hints to what next week's album is gonna be. I host polls where sometimes you get to choose what is on the show, like next week's mid-season special. I make announcements when I'm places that aren't here. You can find all of that on my channel. Alright, let's take the plastic off. So my copy is an original or a very early US repress from 1970 on Apple Records. Good lord, this is what, 4 of the past 5 weeks I've featured an album from the P.O. Box. If I remember correctly, this came in the same package as my Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers and my What's Going On. Thank you, kind stranger. So let's talk about this cover art. All the photos you see here, from the front to the portrait on the back cover and everything in the gatefold, was photographed by Linda McCartney. This was the beginning of 20 years of Paul album art, all photographed by Linda. Here on the front cover, we have a bowl of syrup from maraschino cherries. The cherries are all around it on the white floorboard? This is an interesting snapshot, kind of an optical illusion. The cherries are so perfectly arranged, they look like marbles, and this long, thin strip of white looks like a table runner on a black tablecloth. For a long time, people just assumed this cover was a misprint, and Paul's portrait, with baby Mary wrapped up in his coat, was supposed to be the front cover. But nope. Paul just really liked the cherries. Opening up the gatefold, we have a collage of domestic bliss. Family photos of Paul, Linda, Heather, Mary, and their dog Martha. This is really interesting art all around. The front cover divorces it from the artist entirely. There's no artist's name, portrait, or title, but the back cover and the gatefold establish this as a personal, intimate, homegrown affair, which cannot be divorced from the artist. This personnel section might be the shortest it will ever be because, as seen on this bottom corner of the back cover, Paul McCartney did literally everything. He sang, played guitar, bass, piano, organ, mellotron, drums, wine glasses, and a bow and arrow? Wrote every song and produced the whole thing. The only thing Paul didn't do were backing vocals. Those were Linda. Oh, look at the little red heart under her name. But still, it's hilarious that Paul did this much of the album by himself. Why did he do it like this? Let's find out. Roll transition.
More guitar.
With this next chapter of the video, I'm not just detailing the production of McCartney I. They're the circumstances that wrote this record because those ultimately decided its reception. Basically, how Paul was framed as the bad guy of the Beatles breakup. Our story begins in January of 1969 with the Get Back sessions. In hopes of getting all the guys on the same page again, Paul links up with Michael Lindsay Hogg to make a Beatles TV special. And it worked. Kind of. Jamming on their oldest material was the last time the guys were really on the same page about much of anything. In being consumed by drugs and wanting to be with Yoko every waking moment, John stepped down from the leader of the Beatles role. Paul stepping into that role was a big shift. A big, complicated shift. The problem was, in the beginning, Paul had no idea what Get Back was supposed to be. Was it a TV special, a concert on a barge in a river, a visit to a children's hospital? The rooftop concert idea didn't come along until like halfway through the timeline.
Well, I don't want to go. For God's sake, on the roof.
I would like to go on the roof.
Having the confidence and sense of duty to commandeer the ship, or maybe the cocaine-fueled audacity to take the wheel, while not knowing where to steer the ship, rubs people the wrong way. Paul was doing everything in his power to keep the center of his life, the Beatles, together. In doing so, he inadvertently drove them apart. Looming over everyone's heads was the need to buckle down and pick a new manager. After several failed ventures, it became abundantly clear the Beatles were a lot better at making music than being businessmen. John, George, and Ringo all backed world-class dirtbag Alan Klein. But he wasn't known as a dirtbag just yet. Right now, he's managing money for Donovan and Herman's Hermits, even their buddies the Rolling Stones. Not a bad resume. But Paul wasn't so sure. You see, there were rumblings that the Stones were about to fire Klein, our favorite little screamer. Mick J. noticed something was fishy and lawyered up. Instead of Klein, Paul lobbied hard for Lee and John Eastman, both lawyers and both his in-laws, father-in-law and brother-in-law respectively. The rest of the guys weren't so sure about keeping business all in the family like this. In their minds, that's how Apple Corps went to hell in the first place. They come to a brief compromise. Klein would be interim manager while the Eastmans would be their lawyers. Unfortunately, this led to the worst possible outcome. The Eastmans are fired, and smack in the middle of Abbey Road production, the Beatles officially name Alan Klein as manager of finances. Paul refuses to sign the contract, but majority rules. After rapping on Abbey Road, John pulls all the guys aside and says this will be his last Beatles album. Everyone comes to an agreement John's impending departure won't be made public right now. Paul is devastated. Though Lennon and McCartney hadn't been a collaborative songwriting duo for a while, they were still the core of the Beatles. Having lost control of the center of his life for the better part of a decade, Paul spiraled. He was stoned for most, if not all, of the Get Back sessions and maybe only showered once. By the end of '69, he went full hermit mode, stopped washing, smoked more, and hit the bottle pretty hard. Hard enough that it was freaking his family out. Through all this shit, Linda was his rock, the only sense of security he had left, really. Paul hid away at his farm in Scotland for the rest of the year, and while there, Linda encouraged him to write as a coping mechanism. There really was no big plan for this material. Being so hung up on the Beatles, plus busy working with Apple Records acts Badfinger and Mary Hopkin on their respective albums, Paul didn't really have the energy, mental or emotional, to be writing very much. Instead, he workshopped old stuff, junk and Teddy Boy from that fateful India trip which bore the White Album, and super old stuff like Hot as Sun, inspired by the likes of the Arthur Lyman Group and other exotica from the late 50s and early 60s. In January of 1970, Paul returned to London, popped into EMI to play on I Me Mine, then went home to record what he wrote in Scotland, all by himself. He had a bare-bones setup, just a 4-track recorder and a mic. No mixing desk, no VU. VU? No nothing. This gave his recordings a distinctly lo-fi quality. Lovely Linda, Valentine Day, and Ooh You all came from just messing around with the equipment he had. Once Paul did pretty much all he could do from home, additional work was done at Morgan Studios. Notably not EMI, so he wouldn't run into any of his bandmates. To further ensure his anonymity, Linda booked him the studio time under a pseudonym, or rather, another very real person's name, ex-New York Yankee Billy Martin. This is the second week in a row that sports have been tangentially related to the production of an album. Here at Morgan, Paul recorded some of the kookier tunes, Hot as Sun and Krina Krori. The latter was inspired by a documentary he saw on TV, probably in his perpetual stonedness. This is the song he played the bow and arrow on. After the incident at George and Patty's wedding, I absolutely would not trust this man with a bow and arrow. He goofed around with some wine glasses too. The last of the work was done at EMI, but still under the Billy Martin name, and nowhere near any Beatles or Phil Spector, who was working in Studio 2. Every Night was cut here. Maybe I'm Amazed was put to tape the day after Valentine's Day. Aww. Then Paul smushed Hot as Sun and the Wine Glasses song together, finished up Mama Miss America, formerly known as Rock and Roll Springtime, and cut Man We Was Lonely with Linda. The track listing of McCartney I goes as follows. Opening up side 1, we have the lovely Linda, followed by That Would Be Something. Then Valentine Day, next Every Night, then Hot as Sun and Glasses, followed by Junk, and side 1 closes with Man We Was Lonely. Opening up side 2, we have Ooh You, followed by Mama Miss America, then Teddy Boy, next Sing Along Junk, a reprise of Junk from side 1, then Maybe I'm Amazed, and the album closes with Krina Krori. Now this is where things get interesting, because what was Phil Spector working on in Studio 2? The soundtrack of Let It Be. It's a long-standing myth that Let It Be was the last film of the United Artists 3 feature film contract. It was not. That was Yellow Submarine. I have a whole video on that. Man, this is making it abundantly clear that I have to redux Let It Be. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, the breakup of the Beatles. After Alan Klein was hired, Paul went on strike from EMI and the Apple Corps offices, so the rest of the Beatles straight up didn't know of McCartney I's existence for most of its production. Paul agreed to an April 17th release date with Neil Aspinall, the one guy the Beatles refused to let Klein fire after he took control. On March 25th, George told Paul his April 17th release date wouldn't be an issue with Let It Be. It was nowhere near done yet. What could possibly go wrong? Cue Phil Spector horking up Let It Be ahead of schedule. Now it could be released alongside the film on April 28th. 6 days after Paul and George's chat, Klein moved to have McCartney I delayed until June. This was so Let It Be could be released alongside the film, and there wouldn't be release fatigue in the States following Hey Jude in February and Ringo's solo album in March. The guys endorsed the decision. Ringo is the messenger. This did not go well. Paul shot the messenger. Not literally, he did not have a bow and arrow on hand, thank God. Upon finding out his bandmates went behind his back, at Klein's behest no less, Paul loses his shit and throws Ringo out of his house. After a week of plotting and scheming, Paul does one of the most unhinged things I have ever heard. He mailed his announcement of departure from the Beatles, written like an interview with himself no less, to major press outlets along with promo copies of McCartney I. Then called John saying he was leaving the band. He did not mention making this public, so everyone wakes up the next morning to total fucking chaos. Paul quits the Beatles made headlines all over the world, and he was plugging his new record, which would still be released on April 17th because fuck you, that's why. Incredible. No notes, this is villain behavior and I kinda love it. At the time, this stunt ignited the Paul is the bad guy narrative's fire, making an oddball record like this pretty easy to dunk on. Reception was not good, in part because Rolling Stone exec and all-around bozo Jan Wenner worshipped John Lennon. In the early 70s, being a John Lennon fanboy meant you were beefing with Paul McCartney personally. This fueled years of childish mudslinging between the ex-songwriting partners, with flames only stoked by Rolling Stone trashing Ram at Wenner's behest. To the fans, McCartney I's sonic heel turn was a shock. Paul's lush, ambitious medley dictated how half the last Beatles project went, and now we're playing the wine glasses? What the fresh hell is this? Paul's big I told you so moment regarding Klein came later that year when the Stones did in fact fire him. They sued Klein for Decca's $1.2 million advance plus publishing rights that he'd somehow managed to wrangle away from them. They tussled on and off in court for years, with the Stones losing several times. That's why we have all these compilations. Klein got the rights to distribute them and keep the money. The Beatles themselves had a few rounds in court with Klein, one surrounding George's concert for Bangladesh, another when the remaining 3 Beatles cut ties with him for good. Remember both of those. They will play a big role next week. It's very difficult to evaluate McCartney I without acknowledging the context it was made in and the supreme shit show surrounding its release. The breakup of the Beatles was a mega game of chess with at least 5 players on the board, and McCartney I was Paul's zugzwang. Anything he did surrounding its release would have been a disadvantage to him in terms of his image. He had to make a move, and well, he picked the most chaotic one. So, what do I think of McCartney I? First on the docket, aside from Jan Wenner's meddling, why was McCartney I not received well upon release? Number 1, like I said earlier, this is the polar opposite of Abbey Road, and it would be polar opposite from the subsequent solo Beatle effort, the Phil Spector produced All Things Must Pass. I can't help but feel like had Glyn Johns got his way with the Get Back project, McCartney I might not have felt so out of place. But then again, this heel turn might have been intentional, so there'd be no way this could possibly compete with the Beatles except for the release date thing. Number 2. Most of these songs aren't more than half-baked. There's a lot of excursions. One could say McCartney I is chock full of quirked up white boy tunes. And number 3, there was nothing like this even remotely out there in 1970. Though we remember Ram for drafting the blueprint of the indie pop boom 30 years later, McCartney I displays a lot of the same qualities. Why we don't call McCartney I the first indie album is because it's less sonically cohesive, the Linda vocals are a lot less shouty, and man, this thing is depressed. Stoned and depressed. At least with Ram, we're zooted out of our minds, hooting and hollering over whatever the hell Monkberry Moon Delight was. Did we ever figure out what Monkberry Moon Delight was? When you pick up the first solo effort of a Beatle, one of the guys who was in the biggest band of the 60s, you expect it to kick off with something big. Instead, we have Lovely Linda. It's worth noting we dropped the needle on what was Paul's mic test. This is the first thing he sat down and recorded. It makes us feel like we're sat on his living room sofa, he's curled up in a recliner, we've got fresh cups of coffee, just hanging out. I feel silly calling a 45-second song one of my favorites on the album, but it is. It's so sweet it'll make your teeth hurt. Right down to Paul's little giggle when the muse walks in on him. I also feel a little silly talking about a song for longer than the song is, but in art history, you don't talk about a miniature less because it's smaller in scale than a big history painting. Lovely Linda is crucial to this project. It frames McCartney I as a collection of vignettes. That Would Be Something is simply too long for an intentional sit-down listen. As cute as this clanking drum is, after about 2 minutes, I'm looking around for the clock. I have to say it worked better for me when I wasn't in the room for all of it. My first listen through for this video, I was baking. I was baking Linda McCartney's blueberry muffin recipe, actually. They were quite nice, thank you for asking. A very domestic activity, perfect for this album's tone. Something else to focus on, therefore I had a little more patience for it. Valentine Day is a fun country rock segment. I'd like this a lot better had, that would be something not eroded some of my patience. Take a listen to those drums. The highest tones are clipped. It's evidence of Paul maybe still getting the hang of recording himself. I imagine drums are tricky to mic up when you don't have a VU monitor to tell you when it's blown out. The electric guitar sounds very late Beatles. I can imagine some of these phrases worked into the solo portion of the end. My favorite part of this one is the last 30 seconds where Paul goes totally strum happy on the acoustic, the drums relax, and we go from a driving jam to a more cymbal-driven groove. 4 tracks in, and we finally have the first honest-to-goodness song on the album, Every Night. Took us long enough. We've arrived at stoned and depressed. Paul wants to go out, get things done, get out of his own head, but he can't get out of bed. All he wants to do, and the only thing saving him from wallowing in self-pity, is being with Linda. Acoustic guitar takes center stage. With the layering of those tracks, we have a full-bodied 12-string effect. It gives the song a lovely depth that you wouldn't expect from acoustic, minimal drums and bass. Speaking of bass, being that Paul is a bass player, it's odd we haven't had the grounds to really talk about the bass yet. It does a lot more legwork to build the track than you might think. It starts super minimal through the first verse, a repeated pattern of all of 1 or 2 notes. We venture out through the chorus, and by the end of the second verse, he's created a harmony with what he's singing. Then, through the last chorus, I don't think he plays the same thing twice. Speaking of harmony, part of the magic of Paul's writing is how easy it is to harmonize with it. Sing along to this offhandedly after not hearing it for a while. You'll sing something in key. It probably won't be what Paul's singing, but it'll still sound great with what he is. Every Night's momentum is immediately halted by the medley between Hot as Sun and Glasses. Is it really a medley if it's an instrumental followed by playing the wine glasses capped off by a bit of a song he wrote for Frank Sinatra to sing? Paul must have really been out of his mind if he ever thought Sinatra was gonna sing Suicide. Hot as Sun is just too hokey for me. As for Glasses, as out of place as it seems, it's spooky and therefore a perfect tonal shift into the next song. I know we all hail Maybe I'm Amazed as the crown jewel of this record and one of the greatest songs Paul ever wrote. We will get to that later. But the true centerpiece of this bizarre amalgamation of a record is an unassuming little ditty called Junk. George said the song would have been better had it been filled out with more instrumentation. I thoroughly disagree. Its sparseness is what sells it. I wouldn't want something like this all dolled up. It'd kill the feel. Descending chords played so gingerly as if to apologize for being played at all. Warm bass and fuzzy drums leading us in a broken waltz, dainty bells, crushingly tender delivery. If you're on the verge of tears, be warned, Junk will fucking ruin you. Motor cars, handlebars, bicycles for 2, broken-hearted jubilee. Paul said these lyrics were just a collection of words he liked, but they craft a very specific image. What do all these items in a junkyard have in common? They were once loved, but are loved no more, cast away to decay somewhere, out of sight, out of mind. That's how Paul feels. Then, candlesticks, building bricks, something old and new. Something you find on a dining room table, a toy, and a wedding tradition. Though these belongings could end up in a junk shop someday, the memories Paul makes with his new love will last. As he softly harmonizes with himself and wraps up the song with a finger-picked swirl, we're left spellbound. This is the essence of McCartney I. We have another vibe whiplash moment after the tender, fragile Junk. Paul has laid his heart and soul bare, spilled his loneliness out for all the world to see. In turn, he brings his heart and soul Linda to sing with him. Man We Was Lonely is a rare bright spot in this jumbled up haze. I was lonely, but now I have you. I'm no longer a rusty bike rotting away in a junkyard. You found me, polished me up, and made me new again. There's something old school, early 60s Lover's Lane about that reverberating guitar, and yet it's so modern. The 2010s were all over this sound. If you told me that was on a Lord Huron record, I would believe you. Then we settle into homey front porch vibes cultivated by Linda. This song is delightfully hokey. Like lovely Linda, it's so sweet you might get a cavity. Now let me lie with my love all the while I am home. Home is wherever he's with her. And her little interjections of home are just darling. Ooh You is a positively funky song about what else? Loving your wife. She's the whole package. She looks and walks like a woman, dresses like a lady, is a good cook, good in bed, baby talks with the best of them, apparently. One man of hunger! It's not the first time I've laughed out loud at this. Talk like a baby followed by babbling is ridiculous. Paul really stole the show here, which he'd better do because it's his album. Mama Miss America kicks off with its working title, Rock and Roll Springtime, and it kinda kicks ass. The front half is Paul playing the role of all four Beatles. Simple but punchy drums, that's Ringo. Add some drama with imposing piano chords, that's John. Run your guitar through some effects pedals, there you are, George. And finally, a head-bopping, shoulder-shimmying, bass-driven core, Paul as himself. Then the back half. God, this section is cool. Listen to it and you'll have something different to focus on every time. The full, sturdy sound of the kick drum, the wide runs across the piano keys, the noticeable drops in the bass track's fidelity along the way as more parts are dubbed in. The whole way through Mama Miss America, the guitar is positively gnarly. As affected and muddled as it is, there's a sharpness that cuts through. Teddy Boy is just okay. My favorite part is Linda's airy through the chorus. Other than that, I could do without this song. Aside from lovely use of Mellotron, builds upon itself gorgeously, and a lovely coda for the record, all I have to say about the junk reprise is that it's twice as long as the actual junk. Paul, what are you doing? But again, it's a necessary tone shift. Now, for the moment you've all been waiting for, the only love song that could go toe-to-toe with something, maybe I'm amazed. This is the only song from McCartney I that's garnered much mainstream acclaim. To this day, it's one of Paulie's greatest hits, and the Faces covered this song expertly, like on par with the original expertly. Where Rod Stewart's natural rasp really cranks up the anguish in the lyrics, Paul holds a sweetness. After such a patchworked collection of songs so far, it's refreshing to have something in keeping with Paul's usual polish. We have lots of big, sweeping motions in the instrumentation, drum fills, grand chords and cabaret-like vamps on piano, face-scrunching passionate guitar solos, the descending backing vocals. It's all meant to be very passionate, dramatic, and romantic. This Mellotron doesn't get enough attention. Its warm, muted quality is necessary to balance out all of this bigness. Unless you're really picking up what Paul's putting down in the lyrics, that polish masks his vulnerability. He's expressing emotions that men rarely openly express. Fear, anxiety, loneliness. Maybe I'm amazed at the way I really need you. Paul is just in awe of this woman who is strong enough to support him when he really needs someone to lean on. And he's surprised he can stay faithful to her. That is quite the admission. Paul was a dog in the Beatle days. He was juggling 3 girlfriends at once and a fiance in 1968. Linda put her foot down. If he messed around on her, he would lose all access to her forever. No second chances. So Paul gave up his Casanova ways. But be warned, girls, just because Linda could fix Paul with her love does not mean you can. Paul was the exception, not the rule. He's really laying it all out on this one, even outright admitting he's totally lost in life. Maybe I'm a lonely man who's in the middle of something that he doesn't really understand. Lots of R&B and soul ad-libs are scattered throughout, some more prominent than others. He ramps it up to an impassioned, almost shriek for "Maybe you're the only woman who could ever help me." I wish I was exaggerating. Just a fit of passion overtaking him. He's screaming his love from the rooftop. The collapse of the biggest band in the world is an extremely specific situation to go through. No one could ever really understand that except for the guys themselves, which Paul is estranged from, and the woman watching it all go down from the sidelines. As vulnerable as Maybe I'm Amazed is, there's some restraint. This is only a fraction of the unfathomably deep love Paul had for Linda. His post-Beatles career, and in turn the rest of his life, would have gone a lot differently had he not had his North Star. Finally, the king of the quirked up white boy tunes, Creena Crorey. What the hell is going on here? Little paws running across a guitar case and heavy breathing predating Lindsey Buckingham doing push-ups on Tusk by like 9 years. Would I listen to it on its own? Absolutely not. Would I want anything else closing out McCartney I? Absolutely not. Of an album of ideas, this is the zaniest. Paul, though I may not understand the grind, I do respect it. McCartney I is a strange case. There's a lot of songs I like, but the album is a mess. And yet, these songs sound best in the context of the whole record, aside from putting on Junk, When I'm a Weepy Mess, or getting swept away by one of the greatest love songs ever written. I don't want to just pick out songs and listen to them. This is a mess I want to wade through. Some of the excursions lose me, but the best moments are those of homely charm and heart-wrenching earnesty. And don't forget, Paul did pretty much all of it by himself. Even if the product as a whole is just good and it will be surpassed in quality by its little brother record, writing, performing, and producing an entire album by yourself is a feat of musicianship. These are not the bitter confessions of the villain of the Beatles breakup. This is just some guy expressing his uncertainty of the future and certainty in love. McCartney I is like flipping through the scrapbook of a lonely man caught up in a narrative he would very much like to be excluded from. Every time he was feeling blue, he'd crack the scrapbook open and put something inside. A love letter, a pressed flower, a clipping from a nature magazine. He filled these pages with things that were important to him, so much that they got pasted over by other things and you can't quite close the book. It may not all be of interest to you or me, but making McCartney I was sacred to Paul. The sincerity is enough for me to flip through the scrapbook. My personal favorites on this one are Lovely Linda, Every Night, Junk, Man We Was Lonely, Mama Miss America, and Maybe I'm Amazed. Remember, if you want to keep up with all of my favorites from all of the Vinyl Mondays, I have a Spotify playlist linked in my description. I update it every week. And that's it! That is the debut solo album of Paul McCartney, McCartney I. One of my longtime viewers, his wife, calls this the Cherry Album. I might have to adopt that title. What do you think of that title? What do you think of McCartney I? Leave a comment letting me know. I love hearing what you guys have to say about albums that I love. And remember, despite what some guy on the internet tells you, your opinion matters. If you like what I do here, you should like this video and subscribe to my channel. I post new episodes of Vinyl Monday every Monday morning at 11. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next week for the mid-season special. I cannot believe we're already 6 months into this season. Okay, I have to go like right now to get working on that. Okay, bye.